Imagine growing up where the sound of bombs replaces lullabies, where borders shift like sand beneath your feet, and where every generation inherits not just stories, but scars. The Middle East has been called the cradle of civilization. Yet for over a century, it has also been a cradle of conflict. To understand why, we must first listen not just to the headlines, but to the history, the people, and the pain behind every war fought in its name. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I marked a turning point in the history of the Middle East. For over 600 years, the Ottoman Empire had ruled much of the region, providing a centralized system of governance that, while imperfect, maintained relative unity among its diverse populations. When the empire joined the losing side in World War I, its territories were divided by the victorious European powers, mainly Britain and France, under secret agreements like the Sykes-Picot Agreement. These colonial powers carved up the region into spheres of influence, often drawing borders without understanding or respecting the ethnic, tribal, and religious dynamics of the local populations. Former provinces of the Ottoman Empire were turned into new countries such as Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, and were placed under British and French mandates by the League of Nations. The people living there had little say in these decisions, and resentment began to grow. This laid the foundation for future tensions and nationalist movements. In many cases, the new borders forced rival groups to live within the same state or separated communities that had shared history and culture. The seeds of modern conflict were planted in this era. For example, in Palestine, British promises to both Jews and Arabs about the future of the land conflicted, creating confusion and distrust. These colonial arrangements also supported ruling elites who were loyal to Western powers but often disconnected from the common people. This loss of autonomy, along with broken promises and external interference, left the region in a state of instability. It wasn't just the end of an empire, it was the beginning of a long struggle by the people of the Middle East to reclaim their identity, define their borders, and find a way to govern themselves in a world that had changed overnight. The Arab conflict began in the mid-20th century and remains one of the most deeply rooted and complex struggles in modern history. After World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust, international support grew for the creation of a Jewish homeland. In 1947, the United Nations proposed a partition plan to divide British-controlled Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. With Jerusalem as an international city, Jewish leaders accepted the plan, but Arab leaders rejected it, arguing it violated the rights of the Arab majority living there. In 1948, Israel declared independence, prompting several neighboring Arab countries to invade. This led to the First Arab-Israeli War, resulting in Israel's victory and the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, an event they call the Nakba, or catastrophe. The conflict didn't end there. In 1956, 1967, and 1973, more wars broke out. In the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel captured the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Golan Heights, and Sinai Peninsula. These territories became central to future disputes, particularly the West Bank and Gaza, where many Palestinians lived under Israeli military control. The wars were not just about land, they were about identity, sovereignty, and survival. Over the decades, efforts were made for peace. Agreements like the Camp David Accords and the Oslo Accords gave hope, but violence and mistrust often returned. Groups like the Palestine Liberation Organization (PLO) and later Hamas emerged, some using armed resistance, while others sought diplomatic solutions. Meanwhile, Israeli settlements expanded in contested areas, further complicating peace efforts. Refugee issues, security concerns, and religious tensions surrounding Jerusalem added more layers to the conflict. The struggle became not just between governments, but between peoples who carried generations of pain, fear, and hope, often shaped by personal stories of loss, exile, and longing for peace. The Iran-Iraq War, which lasted from 1980 to 1988, was one of the longest and most devastating conflicts in the modern Middle East. It began when Iraqi President Saddam Hussein launched a surprise invasion of Iran. hoping to take advantage of the internal chaos caused by the 1979 Islamic Revolution. In Iran, Saddam believed Iran was weak and vulnerable, and he aimed to seize control of the oil-rich Khuzestan province and assert Iraq's dominance in the region. Another motive was Saddam's fear that Iran's revolutionary ideas would spread to Iraq's Shia majority, threatening his Sunni-dominated regime. The war quickly escalated into a brutal, full-scale conflict with no clear winner. Both countries used trench warfare, massive artillery, and human wave attacks. Reminiscent of World War I, cities were bombed, civilians were targeted, and entire communities were destroyed. Chemical weapons were used by Iraq, causing thousands of deaths and long-term suffering. Despite enormous casualties on both sides, neither Iran nor Iraq could secure a decisive victory. The international community became involved, with Western countries like the United States, and regional powers like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, supporting Iraq financially and militarily, while Iran stood largely isolated. The conflict drained both countries economically and led to the deaths of an estimated 1 million people. It also devastated infrastructure, displaced millions, and left deep political and psychological wounds. The war ended in 1988 with a United Nations brokered ceasefire, but without any meaningful territorial changes. The legacy of the war lived on through mistrust, political instability, and the hardening of regimes in both nations. It contributed to Saddam Hussein's growing aggression, which later led to the invasion of Kuwait and the Gulf War. For the people of Iran and Iraq, the war was not just a military conflict, but a period of immense human suffering and loss. The Gulf Wars were two major military conflicts involving Iraq and a coalition of international forces, primarily led by the United States. The First Gulf War began in August 1990 when Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, invaded and annexed Kuwait. Saddam claimed that Kuwait was historically part of Iraq and accused it of overproducing oil and stealing from Iraqi oil fields. The invasion alarmed the world, especially because Kuwait was a key oil-producing country, and its occupation threatened global energy stability. In response, the United Nations condemned the invasion and imposed economic sanctions on Iraq. US-led coalition of 35 countries launched Operation Desert Storm in January 1991. Beginning with an intense aerial bombing campaign followed by a swift ground assault. In just over a month, the coalition forces liberated Kuwait, but Saddam remained in power. The war exposed the advanced military capabilities of Western forces and left Iraq's infrastructure in ruins. The US and its allies chose not to remove Saddam at that time, partly to avoid destabilizing the region further. The Second Gulf War began in 2003, when the United States, under President George W. Bush, accused Iraq of possessing weapons of mass destruction WMDs and having links to terrorism. Despite significant global opposition and the lack of concrete evidence, the US and its allies invaded Iraq in March 2003. The initial military campaign quickly toppled Saddam's regime, but no WMDs were found. After Saddam's fall, Iraq descended into chaos. With sectarian violence, insurgencies, and the rise of extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and later ISIS, the war caused massive civilian casualties, displacement, and long-term instability in the region. It also damaged US credibility internationally and sparked widespread debate over foreign intervention. The consequences of both Gulf Wars continue to shape Middle Eastern geopolitics and US involvement in the region. The Arab Spring was a wave of protests and uprisings that began in late 2010 across several countries in the Middle East and North Africa. It started in Tunisia when a street vendor, Mohamed Bouazizi, set himself on fire in protest of police corruption and abuse. His death sparked nationwide demonstrations that led to the fall of Tunisia's longtime president. Inspired by this, people in countries like Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and Bahrain also rose up, demanding freedom, justice, and an end to authoritarian rule. In Egypt, millions gathered in Cairo's Tahrir Square, leading to the resignation of President Hosni Mubarak after decades in power. In Libya, protests escalated into a civil war, ending with the killing of Muammar Gaddafi but leaving the country fractured and lawless. Yemen's uprising eventually led to the resignation of its president but plunged the country into ongoing conflict and humanitarian crises. The most devastating outcome of the Arab Spring was seen in Syria, where peaceful protests against Bashar al-Assad's government were met with violent crackdowns. What began as demonstrations turned into a brutal civil war that has lasted for over a decade. Multiple factions emerged, including Islamist militants, Kurdish groups, and foreign-backed forces, all fighting for control. The chaos allowed extremists, groups like ISIS, to gain territory and power, spreading terror throughout the region and beyond. Millions of Syrians fled their homes, creating one of the largest refugee crises in modern history. Foreign powers like Russia, the United States, Iran, and Turkey became deeply involved, turning Syria into a battleground for regional and international rivalries. The hopes of the Arab Spring were largely crushed by war, repression, and instability. While some countries saw brief moments of change, the overall result was widespread suffering, power vacuums, and a loss of faith in peaceful reform. Proxy wars and foreign involvement have been central to the history of conflict in the Middle East, turning local disputes into international battlegrounds. A proxy war occurs when external powers support different sides in a conflict without directly engaging in combat themselves. In the Middle East, major powers like the United States, Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia have all played roles in various conflicts by providing funding, weapons, intelligence, and political support to their chosen allies. One of the most significant examples is the Syrian civil war, where the US supported opposition groups while Russia and Iran backed the Assad regime. This foreign involvement prolonged the war, increased casualties, and complicated efforts toward peace. In Yemen, a devastating civil war became a proxy conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Saudi forces support the Yemeni government, while Iran is accused of backing the Houthi rebels. The result has been a humanitarian catastrophe, with thousands killed and millions suffering from hunger and disease. In Iraq and Lebanon, political and military groups supported by Iran have gained influence, often clashing with Western-backed institutions or movements. These power struggles have weakened national unity and made governance more difficult. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has also seen regional players, like Iran and Qatar, support Palestinian factions, while the US has remained a strong ally of Israel. In each case, foreign involvement has rarely brought stability. Instead, it has intensified divisions, fueled violence, and made solutions harder to reach. Local populations often bear the brunt of these struggles, living through war, not of their choosing. These proxy dynamics also reflect the broader geopolitical competition for influence in the Middle East, where oil, ideology, and strategic alliances drive decisions. The result has been a region where peace remains elusive, and local voices are often drowned out by the interests of powerful outsiders. Throughout the history of the Middle East war, we've seen a region shaped by empires, divided by borders, not its own, and pulled into conflicts, both internal and foreign. From the fall of the Ottoman Empire to the rise of modern states, from the pain of displacement in the Arab-Israeli conflict to the long suffering of nations like Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, each chapter is filled with loss, but also with resilience. These wars were never just about land or power. They were about people, families caught between rival armies, children growing up among ruins, and communities struggling to hold on to hope. Foreign powers often came not as healers, but as players in larger games, turning already fragile lands into proxy battlefields. Yet through all the chaos, there are still voices calling for peace, justice, and dignity. The story of the Middle East is not just a history of war, it is a reminder of the cost of conflict and the enduring strength of those who survive it. And maybe, by understanding this history with compassion, we can imagine a future where peace is not just a wish, but a promise kept.